Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View. And we're going to continue our conversation with Russ Beaton on sustainable economics. And I thought we'd start off this part of the program with talking about what sustainable economics would look like for most folks and what they would see different from what they see today.
Well, I think you're right, Ken, that there's a big difference between what us theorists talk about and how it might look in practice in neighborhoods for people. But the main reason that sustainable economics as a field, or some call it ecological economics, has arisen in the last couple of decades, really, is that we see constraints coming that typical economics doesn't recognize. And population constraints, production constraints, certainly resource constraints.
Yeah, and I believe there's actually been some books by Johnston who's talking about resource wars coming in the future because the resources are becoming more finite.
Sure.
And people, tendency in the past has been that you fight over them.
Well, there are a lot of predictions around that, wars in the future will be all of them will have some element of resource wars in them.
Right.
And I think our involvements in the Middle East, for instance,
are a good example of that.
Good examples, yeah.
Trying to control what's left of the natural resources as far as energy is concerned.
Yeah, energy is, some say energy is the main resource because if you have enough energy, you have the resources to convert any of the other physical resources into what you might need. So, I think it's no excuse that our culture's first exposure to these kinds of things was with oil.
Okay. So when we talk about sustainable or ecological economics, what exactly are we trying to tell folks? I mean, sustainable in the sense that we can keep repeating what we have currently, or what we're looking at in the future might be a little bit different, where it's something that we can sustain over a much longer period of time?
Well, one of the definitions of sustainability says you must have the ability, anything is a sustainable act if you have the ability to keep doing it permanently. And of course that shifts all the attention to what we would call renewable resources away from non-renewable. Then there's a big argument in economics and in and out of economics, I guess I would say, as to what's renewable and what's not.
And this might not necessarily mean that we have a lower standard of living. It just might be that we have to accommodate things differently.
That's right.
And like our electric use would have to be maybe modified somewhat, because a lot of the other energy sources, say like wind and solar and wave action and like that, aren't necessarily real steady.
They're intermittent.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you might have to bank those and use them at certain times of the day, whereas the use later on in the day might be diminished somewhat.
Well, a lot of energy experts say, Ken, that the big challenge in energy is storage.
Right.
In other words, it's making these intermittent sources available whenever we need them rather than whenever they're available. And there are big experiments and that kind of stuff around. Certainly right here in Salem, there's a facility out on 23rd Street that PGE is experimenting with large-scale battery storage of energy. And I'll be very interested, as one who's taught energy economics and had a lot to do with energy over the years, seeing how that works out.
Well, one of the things too is that we lose a lot of energy in transmission.
Oh, absolutely.
And also in storage, quite often we lose a lot of energy
Yes.
as well. So sometimes, to me, it makes more sense to have not long grids of energy, but have, there's certain cities that have basically said that we're going to try to put solar panels on everybody's home so that you have more energy coming at shorter distances.
Well, you asked the question, how might life be different for just everyday citizens, and what does sustainability or sustainable economics have to say to them? The main thing, I would start that by saying there are resources that you use in your everyday life that are simply not going to be as available, or they're not going to be as available in the manner in which they've been available in the past. You raised the question of electricity. Electricity will be available, but will it be available at
24/7,
ubiquitously 24/7 whenever you want? Right. And there are states experimenting. California's been on the forefront of this, as it is on the forefront of almost everything, good and bad. And that when you use electricity right at peak hour, you actually pay more. There's a higher rate. So there's a whole bunch of incentive systems that one could think about that push people to use it on a more even basis.
Or when you have more energy available,
Right.
that's when you would be using your appliances more,
Right.
and like that. And maybe data centers that run 24/7 might have to allocate their resources a little bit differently.
Oh, exactly. And it's a real fact in energy analysis that you have as much energy as you can supply at peak demand. So, and if you can take the top off peak demand by incentives to use things at other times, whatever, you really effectively have more energy available.
Right. And one of the things, too, that I've often thought about was transportation is another big issue, I think, because we've gotten into where everybody's driving their car to work. And that might not be such a good way to go about things, because basically what you're trying to do is get from point A to point B.
Right.
And there's less expensive and less fuel needed if you're going like public transit, or if you're taking like your bike,
or carpool,
or
if
carpool.
that's possible.
Right.
Yeah.
And so maybe sometimes employers are going to have to look at that situation as far as when they're assigning people particular work hours and things like that, to try to alleviate some of those kinds of problems.
Yeah, businesses, for example, have experimented with flex time,
Right.
which means, I could come in at 6 in the morning and leave at 3 in the afternoon, or be more attractive to me, 10 in the morning and leave at 8 in the evening, something like that. But that has been for the reason of simply traffic jams, avoiding
Right.
traffic. Now, that's not a direct energy reason, but if you don't have traffic jams, you use a lot less energy.
True.
Even if you just drive to work like you normally would.
But we would be looking at it as, say, trying to cut down on the energy use of
Right.
getting people, say, from home to work or for home to shopping, or things of that nature.
Right, and there's a whole lot you can do, but it's long-term with land use planning in
Right.
that sense.
And you need to be building your infrastructure for that in advance. You can't wait till you're in a crisis situation where you're running out of, say, gasoline to power everybody's cars.
Exactly.
And so that's, I think, a critical component of that is people need to be looking ahead at
People and governments, and us acting collectively as well. And there's a tremendous inertia built into the way we do things now, both personally, individually, as well as the way our governments act.
Yeah, and I think part of that is because most of us grew up in that environment.
Right.
We've always seen people with cars. I mean, actually, my parents didn't always have a car when I was real young, but my younger brothers and sisters, they always had a car.
Sure.
And so that's what they're used to. That's what they're used to
How they're
thinking
used to
about
getting
how
around.
Right. But that wasn't always the way it was. And we need to kind of remember that has been something that happens maybe just for a short period of time, and that needs to be rethought.
Well, our cities remind us of that all the time. For instance, here in Salem, there's a very extensive streetcar system back in the early part of the century, of the 20th century. In fact, I think it began, I'm not quite sure, but I think it began being constructed in the very late 19th century. And then you tear up the tracks and the cars take over, in effect. And there's quite a history of that. And now,
We might
in
need
an
to kind
urban
of go
planning
back
sense,
to
we're
that.
going back. And so been some very successful streetcar adoptions in medium and small cities across the nation, let alone the high-speed transit options like Portland's MAX and things like that for bigger cities.
Yeah, and that also actually brings up the point that I sometimes think about, and that's air travel. Because air travel counts basically on like jet fuel, which you get through fossil fuels.
Sure.
And if you're going to have a situation where that's in short supply, they don't really have alternatives for it, even in the medium term,
Right.
as far as what they're going to do about that situation. So air travel might be somewhat restricted, and the rapid rail traffic might be a much better option for us to be putting our money into.
Well, that's a very good thought. There's been a lot of work done on your ecological footprint, how much various resources, especially energy, you can consume and still be not exceeding the bounds of the planet. Well, as an individual, one air flight a year and you're dead.
Oh, okay.
So, air travel, you put your finger on it, air travel is a very difficult thing to justify in a sustainability-based world.
Right.
Takes, I heard once, just one jetliner taking off uses enough oxygen to supply 10,000 people for all the oxygen they need for their lifetime.
That's an awful lot of oxygen
takeoff.
then, yes.
Right.
So, but I mean, those are examples.
That's not fuel, that's air.
Right. But also from the strict, like money standpoint,
Right.
what would people then be looking at as, because we kind of concentrated on energy, but like people earning an income, how would a sustainable economic situation differ from what we see now? Would it be more of a level kind of pay scale for everybody, or would you still have extremes, or how would that look?
Well, it depends on how you structure the downing of the system. One of the things that has always struck me in my work in this area is that it's very clear you can see scarcity coming. You can see resource shortages out there somewhere.
Right.
There's devil's in the details, though, and there's a whole lot of debate as to when we will run out of this or that or the other thing. Well, my feeling has always been if we do nothing about scarcities of energy and all other kinds of resources, especially environment, I might add, dirty air is a scarcity of clean air, in effect.
And
so
same with water.
Same with water and climate, as we're learning. So if we ignore these problems as they come, then we're going to have what I like to call a hard landing in the steady state. And understanding what's coming ahead, even though there are tremendous differences of opinion at exactly when we might run out of something or what its impact will be, is more likely to facilitate, in my opinion, a soft landing in the steady state. And the soft landing, I think your question is basically, what will the soft landing look like? And
Well, hopefully, yeah.
What can people do to if they understand the problem at all, what can they do to make things easier on themselves? And the real problem, in my opinion, especially if you focus on energy, is that we're in a global economy where all our stuff comes from all over the world. We've done that to take advantage of labor costs largely, or corporate America has done that largely
Right.
to take advantage of labor costs. It's tremendously energy using, though, to have a worldwide distribution. So one of the things that people can think about is, how can I create more of what I need and use in my local community? The movement is there with food.
Right.
Movement's there with energy. I'd like to see the movement be there with all kinds of goods and services that we consume.
Well, I mean, if you go into a store to look for clothing, you're going to have a hard time finding clothing that was made in the United States.
Absolutely.
So, in fact, a great deal of it comes from Asia.
You're right.
Not just China, but like Vietnam and other places like that. And
Pakistan, Mexico.
that's a long distance to come to deliver, a shirt and tie or whatever you need. And people need to be looking at the fact that we need to make more of those goods here. And that's going to be a difference, but that would open up jobs.
Well, largely, yes. I'm currently working on a book to address this very question, but in my opinion, we would have more jobs per unit of output that we consume. And think about it, if you buy a shirt or a pair of shoes or any item, and you have two alternatives, one was produced in your local area and one was not, if you buy the one that was not, the dollar purchasing power that you just laid on the market, credit card or whatever, that money is siphoned immediately outside your community. A little bit of it will stick for the salesperson, for instance.
Right.
But if you buy one that's in your local community, you're supporting labor force in your area. So the simple act of consuming something that's locally produced rather than not has tremendous multiplied job benefits in your own neighborhood.
And helps the local businesses because there's more money to be spent by
the dollars to be respent and multiplied. Yeah. Now, that may sound like a beggar your neighbor policy, but one of the things I will contend is that with energy shortages and continued material shortages, we may well be forced to that kind of an economy anyway. That may
sooner or later, I think we are going to
that may be our bottom line.
Yeah.
And the sooner we get there, the higher the standard of living we're going to be able to sustain in the long run.
Well, plus it would be helpful if we did have some of those fossil fuels still left available to us to help cushion that, instead of just flat running out or coming to a point where it becomes so expensive that we can't really afford it.
Right. When the first energy crisis hit in the 70s, and one of my favorite energy analysts is a fellow named Amory Lovins, who heads an institute in Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he recommended at that time a policy which he called the soft path, and he said we should consciously not expand our use of fossil fuels for everyday consumption needs, but we should rather direct those toward the capital needs of the conversion economy that we would need to be facing. Still use it as a base, of course, but simply make a conscious effort to make those fossil fuel resources fund and produce the sustainable society. He never got very far with his recommendation.
Yeah, and that was back in the late 70s,
1976, that article.
Well, he also came out with a book, I believe, called Soft Energy Paths.
Soft Energy Paths. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that came out late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
Or at least that's when I read it.
His organization is the Rocky Mountain Institute.
Right.
Yeah.
And, well, like an example, I believe he was talking about like earth-sheltered homes.
Right.
And there you build into, say, like a hillside, and so like it doesn't take as much energy to heat and cool your home because you're using the earth to kind of insulate it.
Right, and that's a big principle of sustainable economics or ecological economics, is use more of the natural environment as a resource base instead of the produced environment, if you will. In other words, yes, use natural heating. Lovins lives at 7,400 feet elevation in Snowmass, Colorado, and he grows bananas in his house. And it has no outside energy sources. It's totally self-contained. Now it's an experimental place.
Right.
It's a demonstration project, if you will.
Yeah, but there's been other people that have taken the idea about putting solar panels on their homes and also using almost like a greenhouse on the outside of their home to help keep it warmer and to grow like their own fruits and vegetables in these like, south-facing windows and things like that.
The average American food molecule, when I last checked, goes 1,900 miles before you eat it.
Oh, okay, so it's expanded quite a bit over the last 10 years from the time I checked.
And that was a few years ago. It could be higher now.
Yeah, because I remember about 10 years ago I interviewed somebody and they were saying it was 1,300 miles.
Right.
So, but that was probably, early 2000s.
Before Chile came online with its avocados or something like that.
True. So it wouldn't necessarily mean really that much of a reduction in our lifestyle, depending on planning, is the message I'm getting from you, is that if we plan this well, there won't be such a a hard landing. It'll be a soft landing, and we'll be able to
Our
maneuver.
sustainable level of, level of living, level of income, and not just income, but lifestyle, will be higher to the degree that we recognize earlier the constraints that we may be facing. And frankly, if some of the constraints we fear don't come along, we've probably still made a very positive adjustment.
Well, now we've adjusted and learned how to get along without, say, high energy use.
Right.
To do simple things.
Yes. And you asked the question about income. I think a sustainable society would innately have a more even distribution of income. Hard to say, though, how we handle the rich. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and see, I look at it as the fact that the system that we've been in quite often does disproportionately set income levels. And
That's right.
It was only a short period between like the Great Depression and say like the mid-70s that we had something different going on. If you look before that period, you had like the robber barons and so on before that. And if you look at since that time, we've had growing inequality as well. And that, to me, is kind of the normal state that we've had over like the last couple of 100 years.
I think you're right, Ken, and yes, the late 1800s, the robber baron era, and then the 20s, just before the Great Crash, were the eras, along with right now, I hate to say, of our largest levels of inequality. And to me, it's a simple proposition. I don't have to be an economist to note this. As a social scientist, I say that if you're attempting to reach collaboration and agreement in society as to where you want to take that society, the more equal that people are in terms of their status in life, the more you're likely to be able to get an agreement, and policy will follow suit. If you have people with vastly different wealth levels or income levels or stations in life, they're not likely to agree on exactly where we ought to go as a culture. I really believe that part of the widely advertised discord in Congress and culture shock in our society right now is probably due to, fundamentally, the higher levels of inequality.
Well, I think that a lot of us kind of grew up during that period where the economy was flourishing for the middle class.
Yes.
And that's from the 30s to like the mid-70s.
Right.
And you kind of expect that. And you pass it down to your children and like that. But since about, I would say, the late 70s, we've had a very unequal growth. And there's been a lot of people thrown out of work basically by shipping jobs overseas or other places.
Technological change.
Or technological change. And they see that they're not going to be able to provide their children with perhaps as even a good a life as they have had. And that's a dramatic shift for a lot of folks. Not only that, but a lot of times I think they feel threatened about their immediate future.
It's interesting you raised the thought of your children not having the options, because one of the core definitions of sustainability is your children should have all the options you had.
Right. And that's one
Simple.
of the pluses about sustainability, because it should be the same for not just your children, but your grandchildren,
right.
your great-grandchildren.
Children and grandchildren, that principle.
But that's not what we're seeing today.
No,
and I think that's a lot. I think you hit on an important point, is I think a lot of like the Tea Party movement and some of these other things that we've seen are people that feel really threatened by the situation that we're in currently, and are trying to, either go back in time to when things were better, which I don't think they can do.
It's pretty tough.
Yeah. Or we need to start looking ahead and see how we can kind of get back on track so that the middle class and people in general are much better served.
You're right, and I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge for one of the reasons you mentioned a bit ago. A lot of us grew up in the post-war era that is seen as the high point of American middle-class capitalism. More and more now, folks are starting to look at that and say, wow, that was the aberration from life as usual under capitalism, not the holy grail we finally achieved at it. Now it's eroded away, and how can we get it back? It's going to be very tough, because that was an unusual period.
Yeah, and I think a lot of kids of that era see things similar, in the fact that it's scary now for them.
Yes.
And for their children. But I mean, I would think today's students are, kind of, they seem to sense it more, that things aren't the same, that the opportunities for them aren't there.
There's a tremendous affinity on campuses now for sustainability-based thinking, projects, research, lifestyle choices, whatever. Yes.
Okay.
And I find that encouraging. Just simply hope we give them enough
enough
power that they can pull it off. Right.
So I'm kind of curious about, because I talk to some students and they seem to be of that mind, but I don't know if it's because those are the ones that I'm running into, when I go about life, because I don't meet that many of them,
right.
So I'm not exactly sure. So I'm kind of encouraged to hear that the younger students seem to be looking at that a lot more carefully.
That's right.
And trying to see how they can fit. And I think one thing that would be really nice is to make it a lot less onerous for them to go to college. Because
right.
I think that's got to be a scary thing for them, is that they're building up a lot of debt, and they're not exactly sure, I think, as they get toward the end of their college career, how exactly they're going to pay that off.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about all that these days. That's right. And if you stop and think about that, I believe the high cost of college in that sense is a discouragement to go to college, and that's going to make inequality worse. It'll lead much more into a have-not society.
Well, we're just about out of time. So is there any other points you'd like to make that you could?
Well, it's an ongoing discussion. We may need to keep it up. Ken.
Okay. So I want to thank you for watching the Valley View this time. And I want to thank Russ Beaton for coming down and joining us and talking about sustainable economics, because I think it's a discussion that we need to have. And I'd like you to come back next week to Valley View.